Between 1965 and 1973, American and Allied forces documented over 90,000 improvised explosive device incidents in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. These engagements resulted in approximately 11% of total American combat fatalities and 17% of wounded personnel requiring medical evacuation. More significant than the absolute numbers was the disproportionate impact these weapons achieved relative to their manufacturing cost, deployment effort, and material requirements. The National Liberation Front faced a fundamental challenge: how to engage an opponent possessing overwhelming firepower, unrestricted air superiority, and industrial capacity exceeding the entire communist bloc. The solution was not primitive improvisation. It was a systematically engineered weapons program designed around a brutal calculus: wound, not kill; exhaust without engaging; consume American logistics while preserving NLF manpower. This analysis ranks 7 Viet Cong anti-personnel devices by documented operational effectiveness, not by legend, by the operational record. NLF guerrilla doctrine established a clear hierarchy. Primary objective: wound, not kill. A fatality removed one soldier. A serious wound removed the casualty, assisting soldiers, medevac aircraft, surgical personnel, paralyzing a company for hours. Secondary objective: psychological saturation. Units in mine-threat environments underwent measurable behavioral degradation. Patrol speed dropped 30 to 40%. Point man rotation became a source of unit friction. Tertiary objective: intelligence consumption. Every mine strike generated predictable movement patterns that NLF networks monitored and exploited. The devices below were components of this system. The bamboo whip trap. The bamboo whip trap stored elastic energy in a bent bamboo pole 3 to 5 meters long. Tripwire activation released the pole, swinging a stake-studded beam across the trail at chest height. Impact occurred in under 200 milliseconds, faster than human reaction time. What distinguished this device was its targeting profile. While most traps targeted feet and legs, the whipstake aimed for the torso and head. Upper body wounds were more immediately incapacitating, more frequently lethal. NLF doctrine explicitly noted the secondary effect on unit morale. Visible facial and chest trauma affected witnessing soldiers more severely than lower extremity injuries. The device's weakness was terrain dependence. It required specific bamboo species, clear swing radius, and suitable trail configuration. Monsoon conditions degraded structural integrity. The physical profile, a bent pole under tension, proved relatively easy for trained infantry to identify. By 1968, most units had abandoned it in favor of more efficient designs. American countermeasures, including point man awareness training and deliberate vegetation clearance, reduced effectiveness to near zero by 1969. The spike board. A concealed wooden panel studded with fire-hardened bamboo or metal spikes, positioned in shallow excavations along trails. Simple, brutal, effective. Direct foot pressure drove spikes through boot soles into the plantar surface. Construction time, 20 to 30 minutes. No explosives required. No complex mechanisms. Fire hardening at 200 to 250 degrees Celsius created surface hardness approaching mild steel, transforming bamboo into material that reliably penetrated standard U.S. Army footwear. Stakes positioned at 5 to 15 degrees off vertical created wounds difficult to extract. Each attempted removal caused additional tissue damage. A single activation typically delivered 3 to 6 simultaneous puncture wounds, each 3 to 8 centimeters deep. In Vietnamese jungle humidity, even shallow punctures became serious infection vectors within 24 to 48 hours. Average hospitalization, 12 to 28 days. The screaming, immediate, visceral, impossible to ignore, amplified psychological effect throughout the patrol. Wounded soldiers' visible distress affected unit morale beyond the actual casualty count. American countermeasures eventually reduced effectiveness. Steel-soled footwear and systematic trail clearing procedures cut incident rates approximately 60% by 1970. But the device remained operationally viable throughout the war in zones where countermeasures were inconsistently implemented. Materials consisted entirely of locally sourced bamboo and wooden planks. Optimal cost-effectiveness ratio for a system requiring no supply chain beyond village-level resources. The box mine. Wooden or metal containers filled with 200 to 500 grams of TNT scavenged from unexploded American ordnance. Fitted with pressure plate detonators. Waterproofed with rubber sheeting and tree resin. The engineering was sophisticated. Standardized designs, quality control, distributed manufacturing across village-level workshops. The triggering mechanism required 8 to 15 kilograms activation pressure, avoiding premature detonation from wildlife while ensuring reliable function against human targets. Weatherproofing enabled 6 to 18-month deployment cycles without degradation. The blast destroyed the activating soldier's foot and lower leg. Catastrophic tissue damage, traumatic amputation, bone fragmentation. Simultaneously, the explosion produced secondary fragment wounds in nearby personnel within 5 to 8 meters. 2 to 3 casualties per activation was standard. Multiple casualties meant extended halt times, perimeter establishment, simultaneous treatment, multiple medevac requests. Response timelines extending to 3 hours. Neuropsychiatric evacuation rates in companies experiencing multiple box mine casualties exceeded baseline by 34%. Witnessing lower extremity blast amputations created lasting trauma. Soldiers saw what the device did. They understood what awaited them with each step. That knowledge accumulated into measurable psychological degradation over sustained operations. American electronic mine detectors achieved limited success. Wooden casings lacked sufficient metal content for reliable detection. The fundamental challenge remained unsolved throughout the war. The box mine represented mature engineering optimization, standardized construction, all-weather reliability, and tactical effectiveness across all terrain types from jungle trails to rice paddies to urban environments. The cartridge trap. A live cartridge, 5.56 millimeters or 7.62 millimeters, seated in a bamboo tube with a nail positioned ahead of the primer. Buried point upward beneath a thin wooden restraining board. A soldier's footfall drove the cartridge onto the nail. Primer initiated. Round fired upward through boot into foot. Construction required only a single cartridge, bamboo tube, nail, and wooden restraint. Deployment time. Under 10 minutes. The device's minimal profile, often no larger than a cigarette pack, enabled concealment in virtually any environment. The wound itself was rarely fatal but reliably incapacitating. Bone fractures, soft tissue destruction, mandatory evacuation. What gave this device its disproportionate psychological weight was the sound. A soldier standing on bare earth suddenly heard a gunshot, indistinguishable from rifle discharge, and simultaneously experienced a wound. No visible shooter, no muzzle flash direction, just the crack of the round and immediate pain. In dense jungle patrol stress, this combination produced a startle cascade that could trigger immediate defensive fire from the entire unit. Exposing position, consuming ammunition, generating command confusion entirely out of proportion to a single-foot wound. NLF tactical documents captured in 1967 specifically noted this secondary effect. Induced fratricide risk and involuntary position disclosure. As an intended operational feature. The device exploited fundamental combat psychology. Soldiers under stress default to threat response patterns, and an unexpected gunshot triggers those patterns regardless of actual tactical situation. U.S. forces developed no effective countermeasure beyond extreme caution and reduced patrol tempo. The cartridge trap exemplified engineering elegance, maximum effect from minimal resources, with psychological impact exceeding physical damage by orders of magnitude. The Punji Pit. No device was emplaced more widely, more consistently, or with more deliberate doctrinal intent. Pits 1.2 to 1.8 meters deep, lined with fire-hardened bamboo stakes positioned at angles designed to penetrate and lock. A soldier stepping into the pit experienced multiple simultaneous puncture wounds, typically 3 to 7 stakes penetrating the leg, combined with fall impact that often caused bone fractures. The geometry was calculated for maximum extraction difficulty. Vertical stakes wounded on entry, angled stakes wounded on entry and locked on attempted extraction. Many pit designs incorporated both simultaneously, creating a cage effect. NLF training materials indicate that stake contamination was deliberate rather than incidental. Bamboo points were often smeared with human or animal waste, swamp residue, or decomposing organic matter. Not to create mythical poison, but to introduce aggressive bacterial contamination into deep, narrow puncture wounds that were difficult to irrigate in field conditions. The stake geometry drove contaminants several centimeters into muscle tissue while limiting immediate hemorrhage, increasing the likelihood that what appeared to be a survivable injury would require surgical cleaning, prolonged treatment, and extended removal from duty. The objective was not immediate lethality, but predictable medical burden. But the Punji Pit's primary weapon was not the wound. It was the fear. Units reduced patrol speed by 30 to 40% in suspected areas. Soldiers developed neurotic behaviors: refusal to step on discolored ground, refusal to step on leaf accumulations, obsessive visual scanning of trail surfaces. Point man assignment became a source of severe unit friction. Soldiers knew the lead position was statistically most vulnerable, and they resisted it. The psychological weight accumulated over weeks and months into measurable combat effectiveness degradation. Countermeasures: lead scouts with probing rods, explosive charges to collapse suspected pits, reduced effectiveness by approximately 50% by 1969, but never eliminated the threat. The device achieved its strategic objective: degrading American operational mobility through sustained environmental anxiety. The Punji Pit forced every patrol to make a choice between speed and safety, and there was no right answer. The grenade trap. The tripwire-activated fragmentation grenade represented operational efficiency perfected. A grenade, NLF manufactured, Chinese supplied, or recovered American ordnance. Monofilament wire, an anchor point. Emplacement time, 15 to 20 minutes. A grenade with safety pin withdrawn, held by a tensioned tripwire passing through the pull ring. A soldier's leg contacted the wire at boot height. Pin pulled free. Safety lever released. Fuse initiated. 4 to 5 seconds until detonation. Enough time for recognition, not enough time for meaningful response. The psychological cruelty was precise. A standard M26 grenade produced lethal fragmentation to 5 meters and wounding fragmentation considerably beyond. A single activation in a tight trail file, soldiers spaced 3 to 5 meters apart, routinely produced 2 to 4 casualties. The psychological signature was distinct and particularly persistent. A Punji Pit offered a visual lesson. Soldiers could examine the hole, understand the mechanism, theoretically adapt. A tripwire grenade offered nothing. The wire, often monofilament fishing line, was effectively invisible in vegetation at boot height in low-light conditions. Soldiers knew the trigger existed somewhere. They could not reliably detect it. That combination, knowledge of threat, inability to identify it, is operationally precise in its psychological effect. U.S. forces developed tripwire detection techniques. Point men received specialized training. Effectiveness reduced only marginally. The fundamental asymmetry proved insurmountable. Attackers chose activation points. Defenders were forced to traverse unknown terrain. The grenade trap represented the apex of effectiveness to complexity ratio. No indigenous manufacturing required, only tactical employment of captured American munitions against their original users. The psychological irony of being wounded by one's own weapons amplified the trauma. The buried artillery shell. The buried artillery shell was the weapon that broke units. A single 105mm shell contained approximately 2.2 kilograms of high explosive. The 155mm variant contained 6.9 kilograms. Buried beneath a trail and fitted with a pressure detonator, these devices produced blast effects that defied comprehension. Soldiers within 5 meters suffered immediate fatal injuries from overpressure alone. Internal organ rupture, traumatic amputation, catastrophic fragmentation. Personnel within 15 meters sustained severe wounds requiring immediate evacuation. The blast crater, typically 2 to 3 meters diameter, 1 to 1.5 meters deep, physically interdicted the trail. Between 1965 and 1972, U.S. aircraft delivered 7 million tons of ordnance. Dud rates in soft jungle soil ranged from 10 to 30%. NLF recovery teams treated unexploded ordnance as a supply depot, recovering shells at zero cost. Units experiencing shell trap casualties exhibited combat effectiveness degradation of 40 to 60% for 72 to 96 hours post-incident. Neuropsychiatric evacuations from affected companies increased 156% above baseline in the 2 weeks following encounters. The trauma was not limited to direct witnesses. It propagated throughout battalions via testimony and rumor. The overpressure wave was felt hundreds of meters away. The sound echoed through jungle corridors. Follow-on units approaching the site encountered devastation that exceeded anything in their training. Multiple casualties, catastrophic wounds, body parts, blood. The terror forced American units to reduce patrol ranges, increasing reliance on fire-base-centric operations that surrendered area control to Viet Cong forces. Companies that had experienced shell trap incidents showed measurable reduction in patrol aggressiveness and elevated rates of command friction regarding mission assignments. Soldiers who had never personally experienced a shell trap activation exhibited anxiety symptoms based solely on knowledge that such devices existed in their operational area. From an engineering perspective, the device exemplified asymmetric warfare economics perfected. American forces expended the original artillery shell. Viet Cong forces recovered it at zero cost. Addition of a pressure detonator, materials worth perhaps $2 to $3, converted it into a weapon consuming American resources valued at $50,000 to $100,000 per incident. The buried artillery shell achieved strategic effects disproportionate to deployment frequency, not through volume, but through sheer devastating impact that could not be rationalized, processed, or overcome through training or doctrine. These devices did not operate independently. They operated as a coordinated terrain denial system. Outer trail approaches carried Punji Pits and Cartridge traps. Low-cost, high-volume devices maximizing early contact probability. Trail junctions received grenade traps and box mines. Higher casualty yield at choke points. High-value corridors received buried artillery shells. Most severe casualties and longest operational halts. The result was an environment with no safe behavioral response. Moving cautiously consumed time and exposed units to observation. Moving aggressively accepted device risk. Known trails were most heavily seeded. Off-trail movement entered terrain where pits were heaviest. This was the doctrinal achievement, not any individual device, but the system that made every tactical option a calculated risk. Between 1965 and 1972, mines and booby traps accounted for approximately 11,000 American deaths and 70,000 to 90,000 total casualties. The United States entered Vietnam with the most sophisticated military technology deployed in any conflict to that point. What the NLF improvised weapons program achieved was the systematic conversion of those advantages into irrelevance. American forces never developed comprehensive countermeasures. The fundamental problem remained unsolved. Defenders choosing engagement locations possessed insurmountable advantage over forces traversing unknown terrain. The ground was never neutral. The most effective weapon in Vietnam was not fired, launched, or dropped. It was buried.